Welcome back, everybody. Well, from time to time, I like to do these kind of anthology compilation videos where we look back to a reaction series that I did a few years ago that maybe if you're new to the channel, you've never seen, or maybe if you've been around, sometimes I get people requesting that I make one long video out of an entire series. So it's more convenient to watch. Whatever the reason, this is one of those opportunities. And so we're going to be taking a look back 3 years ago to my reaction to the series by Extra History about Teddy the Trustbuster. Here it is. You'll notice that the quality is not what it is today of my videos. I've learned how to use the equipment and the lighting and all that sort of stuff a lot better, but the content I think is still really good, so enjoy. Welcome back, everybody, to another Extra History reaction series. Well, I mentioned a couple of days ago that we are going to be doing a series on the history of Turkey and of the Ottoman Empire, and that is coming next week. That'll be after this series concludes. But I've wanted to do this one for a while now, and while I continue to work on some editing of some of my original content, I wanted to dive into Extra History from Extra Credits, is the name of the channel, on Teddy the Trustbuster, obviously referring to Theodore Roosevelt and his history of trust busting. If you have not seen the History Channel's series, The Men Who Built America, I highly recommend it. It'll give you a lot more detail into this time period, talking about people like Rockefeller and the like. I have not seen the Extra History series yet that we're about to react to, but I have a feeling I have a pretty good idea of who it's about, Rockefeller in particular, who was one of the big opponents of the Roosevelt administration during all of this. So I'll offer my own feedback as we go along. As always, check out some of the links in the description below. Make sure you support Extra Credits and their original content. Give them a like. Check out the original link in the description below. But let's go ahead and dive into part one of Extra History's Teddy the Trustbusters.
Titusville, Pennsylvania, 1872. Down with the conspirators, reads one banner. No compromise, says another. The protesters, small independent oil refiners, marched toward the railroad junction, led by local oilman Franklin Tarbell. They swarm over the rail yard, flipping rail cars, spilling their cargo of oil barrels, and smashing open any marked with the Standard Oil logo.
So, yeah, we're going to talk about Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller in just a minute. So Titusville, Pennsylvania is in Venango County, which is in western PA. If you look at Pittsburgh and just draw a line north, maybe an hour or so north, like 70, 80 miles, something like that, you find Titusville. It's a small town in Venango County, really kind of out of the way. It's not really near anything important, but it's where they find oil. And it becomes one of the early sources of crude oil. Up until this time, oil was kind of an afterthought. It wasn't really something that was used all that much. Primarily things like whale oil were used for oil lamps and things like that. But oil wasn't really a major player on the world stage the way it is today. That really starts to change because of things like what happened in Titusville. And so oil then, getting that oil from that kind of remote place like Titusville to the major centers of industry like New York or even eventually somewhere like Pittsburgh is going to rely on rail. And that's where John D. Rockefeller comes in. He's not initially necessarily strictly an oil baron, but he's the guy who is able to make oil into a necessary component of society.
News has leaked that John D. Rockefeller's rising giant, the Standard Oil Company, has brokered a secret deal with the railroads. The rail barons will double their transportation rates on all oil producers, but give Standard a rebate, driving small independent producers out of business so Rockefeller can buy them out. But despite the Pennsylvania legislature dissolving this backroom deal, things are already in motion.
So Rockefeller, he's actually from the Cleveland area, which is not far from Titusville. And yeah, like I said, if you watch something like History Channel's Men Who Built America, you'll really get a lot of the background into how Rockefeller made his money. I actually visited John D. Rockefeller's grave recently up in Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, and he's buried very near to the guy who ran the rail company that helped make him rich. And I tell a little bit of that story there.
Through strong-arm tactics and ruthless expansion, Standard will soon control the U.S. oil market, making Rockefeller the richest person on earth. Franklin Tarbell cannot stop Rockefeller. No man can. Because it will be Franklin's 14-year-old daughter, Ida, who will break Standard Oil. Thanks so much to CuriosityStream for helping to keep this history flowing. To get a discounted deal with Nebula included, check out the link in the description below. By the turn of the 20th century, a few massive corporations, often called the trusts, due to the corporate structure they were organized under, dominated American life. From railroads to meat to steel and oil, trusts strangled competition and wielded more political power than many senators and governors.
So this is actually the onset of the time when you start to have, for example, the Republican Party closely allied with big business, and why to this day people talk about that connection. It really starts here. The McKinley campaign was one of the first presidential campaigns that was largely funded by a couple of really rich, influential people. I'm not saying necessarily that William McKinley wasn't his own man or that he was bought out in some way, but these men did finance his campaign. So this is when money is power for really kind of the first time in the United States history. And these trusts, they were able to just buy out any competition. And you can't even really compare it to something like Walmart, for example, today, though there are some elements of that. So Walmart, for example, will go to Heinz and say, listen, Heinz, you sell us your ketchup and your other products for less than you sell it to the mom and pop place down the street. That's why Walmart's able to sell stuff so cheap, is because they negotiate these deals that make things cheaper on their end of purchasing so that then they can turn around and sell them cheaper. And people like Rockefeller did the same kind of thing. They made deals where they would promise to buy large amounts of something in return for being able to get it at a cheaper rate. And then they would use the profits they made from that to buy out all the competition who couldn't compete with their financial deals that they were able to make. And then they started to gobble up all the areas of things. So Standard Oil wasn't just making oil. They were also selling the oil. They were also controlling the rail that transported the oil. They were controlling all means of production, and that's why they became these trusts. They controlled everything from beginning to end.
But in 1901, the trusts would find a new opponent. A president unexpectedly thrust into the role, Theodore Roosevelt, who would usher in the era of trust busting. Yet the story of trust busting doesn't begin with him.
So, and it's interesting with Theodore Roosevelt too, we've talked about this. Theodore Roosevelt, nobody expected him to become president. They actually made him vice president to get him out of the way. He was governor of New York at the time. He was not your typical Republican at that time, wasn't your typical pro-business kind of guy. He was very progressive as far as Republicans go. But they made him vice president on the ticket with McKinley to shut him up, basically, to put him in a seemingly insignificant and less influential role than he had as governor of New York, as being very outspoken. Well, he becomes president when McKinley gets assassinated, and you go from McKinley, who was supported by these big businesses, to now the president being his former vice president, who actually ends up being a threat to those same businesses.
Because while Roosevelt disliked the monopolies, to take on such powerful business interests, he would need massive public support for action. Public support that would not come from Washington, but from a magazine office. The offices of McClure's Magazine, New York City, 1901. In the 31 years after her father fought Standard in Titusville, Ida Tarbell has come a long way. She's now 44 years old and an editor at the prestigious magazine McClure's. One of the few American women with a science degree, she became a specialist in writing about technical topics like public works and the military, as well as blockbuster serialized biographies of Napoleon and Abraham Lincoln.
You know, this is one of those things that I don't think people talk about enough. Women at this time in history don't necessarily have the roles where they're in charge. You know, they don't even have the right to vote yet. They're not in Congress, they're not president, they're not in the cabinet, stuff like that. But women found ways to be influential. You know, the prohibition movement, for example, was a lot of that was from the women's temperance movements. You know, and here's another example of a woman finding a place to be influential and having a huge impact on American history without necessarily doing it in the traditional way.
But as Tarbell and her research assistant shuffle through contracts, corporate documents, legislative transcripts, and interviews, it's quickly becoming clear that this next story will be her biggest yet. A history of the Standard Oil Company, its rise, and its misdeeds. A series so dangerous that Tarbell's father warns her not to do it. In fact, the magazine's funding has already been threatened by a Rockefeller-owned bank. But Tarbell practices a new kind of journalism, one that relies on public documents, legislative and court transcripts, and verifiable facts.
And again, so you hear that little tidbit where they mentioned that a bank controlled by Rockefeller is threatening them. You know, if you're a business, you will get swamped by the money and power of a company like Standard Oil. So that's why you really only have the government to turn to. Because Standard Oil, with all the money and power and influence they have, they can influence the banks. They can influence the courts. They can bog you down with legal, be bombarded with legal issues to where you just go under just trying to defend yourself.
In addition to interviews. It's so new that the discipline doesn't even have a name yet, though today we call it investigative journalism. Now, the magazine decided to look at Standard because, unlike the rest of the trusts, it had a single owner and will be an easier story to tell. The history of Standard will provide a window into how these companies control American commerce. And Tarbell's first task is looking at the earliest days of Standard Oil and its founder, John D. Rockefeller. Born in upstate New York in 1839, Rockefeller grew up in financial insecurity. His father, Doc Rockefeller, was a con artist who masqueraded as a doctor.
Today, we have the term snake oil salesman. This was a big thing. This is before people had all the knowledge that we have today about science and medicine and things like that. And so you had these people who were traveling salesmen who would come to a town and say, I've got this new cure, drink this arsenic and it will cure your cancer. I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit, but that's the kind of thing. And you can look at newspapers from the day and see advertisements, and it'll say like, Mrs. Jones over on 3rd Street swears by this oil that she uses and she applies 3 times a day and it has cured her smallpox, that kind of thing. And so this was a big deal, and people would jump into this. Sometimes they believed in the products they were selling. Other times they knew it was stuff that really didn't work, but they preyed on people's lack of education and lack of knowledge in those areas to try and make a quick buck.
Selling fake cures on the road. So during his absence, John was forced to step up, raising turkeys to help the family. His mother, a devout Baptist, taught him the principles of hard work, thrift, and charitable giving. While his father, by contrast, taught his children by swindling them as a way to keep them sharp. In fact, once, Doc Rockefeller held out his arms, urging young John to jump from a high chair
Trust fall.
into his grasp. Then, when John took the leap, Doc just let him fall.
I understand what he was trying to do, but what kind of a jerk are you to do that to your kid? As a dad, I am never doing that kind of crap to my kid, but I understand what he was trying to accomplish with that. But, boy, imagine what that did to Rockefeller, his psyche, and how it formed him at such an early age how to think.
Never trust anyone completely, he told his son. Even me. Doc ditched the family when Rockefeller was 16, disappearing from public record. Young John became a bookkeeper to support the family, and then by age 20 had gone into business for himself, branching into refining oil with several partners. But by 1870, he'd pushed said partners out and took control of what was now dubbed Standard Oil. America ran on oil, specifically kerosene, which lit homes in a way that was cleaner and more efficient than whale oil. And that was exactly how Rockefeller liked things, clean and efficient. And as Tarbell researches his methods, she finds herself impressed, indeed even admiring Rockefeller.
So Rockefeller then starts to, and like I said, if you watch The Men Who Built America, they give you all the details on this. He starts to buy not only the source of production, but the means of production, the transportation in between. He starts to get his hand into all of these things. He starts to find new ways, because remember, the idea of refining oil is to separate oil into its component parts. Kerosene is part, gasoline's another, and so you would use the kerosene from the oil, but what do you do with the rest of it? Taking that crude oil and refining it, and so it was finding new reasons, what's the word I'm looking for, finding new ways to use the other byproducts of crude oil, and then being able to sell and market those as well.
He was a major innovator because at the time, when refining petroleum, often only about 60%
I just said
became
that.
usable as kerosene, while much of the rest were flammable byproducts that they dumped into rivers and lakes, making them occasionally catch on fire. But Rockefeller
In Cleveland.
turned many of these byproducts into lubricants, chewing gum, paint, and even figured out that one of the biggest waste products, gasoline, could fuel his factory machinery. And while Tarbell applauded these innovations, her admiration didn't extend to Rockefeller's business practices. He expanded aggressively, buying out his competitors. And if they didn't take his offer, he'd undercut their prices and dive rivals into unprofitability before purchasing the ruined corporations. And this was a thing he didn't just do to rivals, but also friends who'd helped him get started in business.
His father told him don't ever trust anybody, but that's advice that other people should have taken when dealing with him, apparently, as well.
He also began to expand vertically, buying barrel makers, oil producers, distributors, lumber companies, and
Trust.
chemical manufacturers.
Buying everything.
So he could control every part of the supply and distribution chain. And eventually, he would invest in pipelines, so Standard could stop paying railroads and move its product more efficiently. Rockefeller also had, let's say, a strange feeling about capitalism and money. He looked on his mission to expand Standard as almost a divine calling. In his mind, he was making the oil market more efficient and costs lower. He treated employees well and rewarded those who took his buyouts. But if they resisted, he bankrupted them without mercy, often via secret deals.
So it's interesting, and I never had heard that part before, that he actually thought what he was doing was actually helpful to the consumer. But honestly, if you think about it, driving out all the opposition and all the business, I understand that controlling all the means of production can lower costs, but when you have no competition, you have no reason to lower your costs. Once you control everything, you can raise it to whatever you want to and find that sweet spot where you can make the money. So, kind of dirty.
It was God's will, he believed, for the strong and well-run to conquer the weak and inefficient. In 1872, Standard bought 22 of its 26 rival oil producers in Ohio within 3 months, an event remembered as the Cleveland
Massacre.
And it was only the start. For within a decade, Standard would control 90% of the U.S. oil market and about 85% of the global market. As she begins to write, Tarbell reflects that she does not begrudge Rockefeller's success, or even Standard's growth. It's the tactics she considers unfair. Standard offering products at such a discount that competition was forced to sell and become part of it. The backroom deals, bribery of public officials. Tactics like the South Improvement Company, the entity formed in order to facilitate the secret deal between Standard and the railroad companies that put her father out of business. She finds a book about Pennsylvania's investigation of the deal in the New York Public Library, the only remaining copy after Standard destroyed the rest. She gathers details from legislative minutes and lawsuits, turning rumor into fact, forming a picture of the Southern Improvement Scheme and uncovering evidence that even after the deal fell apart, Standard continued to collude with the railroads to get anti-competitive rebates on shipping its products.
So it's interesting that, it took this long for somebody to start digging into all this stuff. You have to figure that Rockefeller made a lot of enemies by putting so many people out of business and bullying so many people with his money and his power and his influence. Good for this woman for being the one who was willing to do the dirty work and to dig and to compile the evidence to make this happen. I'm just surprised it took as long as it did.
But she finds more than that. Crossing the country, she talks to grocers driven out of business by Standard. Standard employees would come threaten them, saying that if the grocers refused to switch to Standard products, the company would open a rival store, and they would follow through, offering such discounted goods that no grocer could survive. She also charted how Standard's reorganization as a trust in 1885 actually circumvented antitrust laws. Many states forbid a single company working across state lines. So, Standard formed a trust company in New York that gave orders to smaller state-based companies with names like Standard of Ohio. In truth,
And Standard of Ohio still existed when I was a child. It was eventually bought out by BP. But when I was a kid, there were no BP gas stations. There was Sohio, which is Standard of Ohio, which I can still remember seeing their logo, which looked much like the Standard logo with the red, white, and blue. It just said Sohio on it instead.
Rockefeller controlled them all. But Tarbell had an odd ally in understanding standard, Henry Rogers, the Trust's vice president. Believing the articles will be complimentary, he granted her access, answering every charge she made, helping her understand Standard's perspective. However, when the article is published, he would not like what she had to say, because she'd learned far more than Rogers knew, and she learned it from an unusual source. 1904, New York City. Tarbell can see the man is nervous. He wants to leave. He stammers out a story about a kid he teaches in Sunday school, an office boy at Standard headquarters, the one who burns documents. Except when the boy saw his teacher's name on some of the papers, rather than putting them in the furnace, he brought them to him instead. The man, you see, is also a small-time oil refiner. Tarbell opens the man's briefcase and sees a stack of paper.
Wow.
Price lists, train tables, distribution routes, all with dates and amounts. But none of these are for Standard's products. They're for Standard's competitors. And this information is all Standard needs to undercut its rivals, flood markets, and manipulate oil prices to stay on top. It's hard evidence of something that Tarbell has suspected for years. Standard bribes railroad agents to provide data on its competitors' shipments. Rockefeller isn't preternaturally good at reading the market. He's just running a nationwide espionage network.
It's, in some ways, you could argue that the guy's like a mob boss. I mean, he's got all the same kind of tactics at play, using money and influence and fear and bribery to get what he wants and to get ahead.
And it's this revelation that will win her the support and attention of a new fan, President Theodore Roosevelt. But stop the presses, because we've got an exclusive.
All right, so, and I will say this as we move forward with this, good for Theodore Roosevelt, because that was kind of in some ways going against his own self-interest, because he was going against the very people who supported his party. And so that tells you a little bit about him as a human being and as someone who had integrity that rose above party politics into doing the right thing. But I'm interested to learn more about this. There's some things there I did not know before. Let me know your thoughts about all this. I think this will be a fun topic to discuss further, and we'll see you tomorrow with episode 2. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 of our reaction series to Teddy Roosevelt Trustbuster from Extra History. Hope you guys enjoyed part 1. A few of you commented on something about a little bit of an echo with the sound. I can't quite figure out what could have caused that. All my settings are exactly the same, and not everybody noticed it, and I did a little test run with this recording. It seems to be fine. So I guess we'll see. I don't know if it's just something about certain playback devices or hearing it and other ones aren't. But got everything as best I can do. Hopefully that's not too much of an issue. If you didn't see part 1, there's a link in the description that'll take you back to that first episode. We're picking up right where we left off. A couple of real quick announcements that I talked about yesterday in the stream. I am planning on going to Vicksburg sometime in probably mid to late August. If that's something you're interested in, I should in the next week or so have the exact date that we will be planning a meetup, and we're going to do several hours of touring the battlefield together, looking into seeing if we can even get one of the battlefield guides to come out with us to show us around. So I am going to be there for a couple of days making content for the channel, but I want to set aside one day where we can get together, anybody who might be interested, to tour the Vicksburg battlefield with me. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure you have your notifications on, because I will be posting with details about how you can be a part of that if you want to do that. We're also looking at getting Camp Toccoa in Georgia for the weekend, hopefully sometime in October. We will spend the weekend there, sleep in the barracks on the base, hike Currahee together, watch Band of Brothers on the base, go to the Currahee Museum in town. It'll be a lot of fun, a great opportunity to soak in some World War II history. So more details to come about that. Let's dive into part 2.
Cleveland, 1905. John D. Rockefeller enters the Baptist church he's attended since he was 14. A church that's still full of blacksmiths and shopkeepers, people he's known his whole life. Things haven't been easy. That Tarbell woman's articles have turned the world against him. His family is suffering nervous conditions, his wife paralyzed by stroke, and an unknown disorder has caused all of his hair, including his eyelashes and eyebrows, to fall out. For years, he'd let people treat his estate like a public park, but now he's building a fence. Armed Pinkerton bodyguards follow him everywhere, and he sleeps with a revolver by his bed. Even that cowboy president Teddy Roosevelt is after him. despite how generous Standard has been to Republican politicians.
And we talked about that a little bit yesterday. It's when Teddy Roosevelt runs as the running mate for William McKinley's second term. McKinley's previous vice president had died in office, and so they needed a new vice president for his second term, and they choose Governor Roosevelt of New York, thinking that it's a good place to hide him and put him away. And McKinley's one of the first presidents that's really seriously backed by big money, big business money, including the money from John D. Rockefeller, who's also from Ohio, like William McKinley is. They're both Northeast Ohio guys. But now Roosevelt comes to power, and he doesn't kind of toe the party line. He doesn't he's a man unto himself. And like a lot of people have commented, Theodore Roosevelt, if you have not heard his story, you have to learn it. There is a movie in the works. Apparently, Leonardo DiCaprio is going to play Theodore Roosevelt in the movie. I don't know how that's going to go, but the last time I heard a casting decision that I thought was nuts, it was Heath Ledger playing Joker, and that turned out really well. So I am cautiously optimistic about Leonardo DiCaprio playing Theodore Roosevelt. But I hope they do it justice, because that is a story everyone should know. The guy was like the ultimate American. He really, really was. At the end, stick around to the end of this video, because we're going to add a little something to this one. Somebody shared with me yesterday a video of John D. Rockefeller, like an actual video of him speaking when he was like in his 90s. So we're going to watch that at the end of this video.
But at least he feels safe here, at his church, where he gives Sunday school lectures and hands envelopes of money to parishioners who have fallen on hard times. His people. He doesn't see Ida Tarbell sitting a few pews away.
Wait, so she showed up at his church in Ohio, in Cleveland. Like, I mean, is she like just... This is a gutsy woman, but I'm curious to know what her... Like, is she trying to intimidate him? Because I don't know how you intimidate the world's first billionaire. But this woman has no fear whatsoever, and I admire her for that.
Thanks so much to Ting Mobile for helping us keep the history flowing. Ida Tarbell's series, A History of the Standard Oil Company, ran in McClure's magazine until 1905, and it completely changed public attitudes about trusts and big business. Granted, when the big trusts like Rockefeller's Standard Oil and Andrew Carnegie's U.S. Steel were building themselves in the 19th century, they had caused a great deal of controversy within their industries on a state-by-state basis, but that anger and mistrust was unfocused. The business structures of these trusts were, often intentionally on the part of the trusts, difficult for the public to understand. Holding companies obscured the sheer scale of the trusts, and anti-competitive practices like railroad rebates and price fixing were so technical and detail-oriented, it was hard for individual citizens to pin down exactly what was wrong.
And not only that, but this is a different time. You know, it's not like today where everybody's got access to news 24/7, and we are inundated with information. First of all, newspapers for the most part at that time were pretty unashamedly partisan. Like you had, you might have like the Center County Democrat. I mean, these were papers that were legit biased, and they were intentionally so. They weren't trying to be fair and balanced. They weren't trying to be unbiased. They had an agenda, and they were honest about that. And a lot of people didn't read the newspapers. A lot of people didn't go to school up through high school and then go to college afterwards. A lot of people didn't have near the education they have today. Literacy, I think in this time is probably like 80 to 90%. So literacy is still pretty high, but not as high as it is today. So it's a very different world. And so people didn't have the level of knowledge about things going on as they do today. And like you said, not only that, but a lot of times it takes public opinion of something before the government will act on it sometimes. And that's sometimes good, sometimes bad. In the aftermath of the Civil War, we're going to be doing some stuff about Reconstruction coming up here probably in a month or so. Ulysses S. Grant, for example, was very, very supportive of the former slaves, and probably one of the most pro-civil rights presidents we've ever had, certainly in that time period up until recent time. But public perception and public opinion of Reconstruction in the South started turning heavily against Reconstruction by his second term, and it made it harder and harder for him to accomplish things. And so sometimes that works both ways.
Sure, there had been some legislative action on Standard, such as in 1892, for example, when the state of Ohio managed to use antitrust laws to separate Standard of Ohio from the rest of the company. But corporate reshuffles or protracted legal battles often blunted even these small victories. But now, Tarbell exposed how a network of 250 companies, many related in Byzantine deals, controlled everything from the price consumers paid for vegetables and alcohol to working conditions and hours across multiple industries.
It's no different than today, right? I mean, there's a handful of companies that own pretty much everything. You know, Disney, which Disney's, I guess, part of, isn't that part of ABC? General Electric owns a ton of stuff. I mean, there's a small number, probably even a smaller number than this, that kind of own everything.
More importantly, though, it presented this information cleanly by centering the investigation on Standard, the one trust owned and controlled by a single man. This kept the story comprehensible and gave the readers a central character to rally against. In fact, often, she described Rockefeller and Standard as if they were the same entity, even after he had retired to focus on charity. And she decided to close the series with a two-part personal sketch of Rockefeller himself, which is where the usually reserved Tarbell let the venom flow. Describing him in church, she wrote that he looked like a living mummy, hairless and reptilian, powerful yet nervous, a ruthless king, terrified of assassins who might be in his midst.
Seems a little bit too far. I was on her side when she was sharing the information and explaining to people what was going on in their business practices, but now it seems like it's getting a little personal to me. I don't know how I feel about that.
But in actuality, Rockefeller was not the broken man Tarbell suggested. Even as his family suffered under the public strain, Rockefeller kept playing golf and running his charitable foundation. Granted, getting annoyed whenever a prominent religious organization turned away a donation of his as tainted money, but still, he stayed silent, believing the controversy would only grow if he dignified it with a response. It grew anyway. Tarbell's series sparked a national sensation. She exposed family secrets, like that Rockefeller's father, Doc Rockefeller, had fled New York with the family after being indicted for rape.
Ooh, I didn't know that. Wow. So, you know, they talk a little bit there about him giving a lot of money away and setting up charities and having retired from the day-to-day running of the business. And this was a pretty common thing that a lot of these early barons or tycoons did. People like Vanderbilt and Rockefeller and Carnegie. You know, what they did was they used these ruthless practices to accumulate all this wealth. And then once they had more wealth than they could ever possibly spend in 20 lifetimes, they started giving it all away and kind of thinking about the future and their legacies. And so, for example, you go to anywhere in Western Pennsylvania and pretty much every town will have a Carnegie something, a Carnegie Center, a Carnegie Library, things like that. Rockefeller Center in New York City is a perfect example of some of the stuff that he set up. So you'll find these sorts of things. Their footprints and their charitable giving is all over the country to this day.
Scandal that only deepened when her research assistant caught wind that Doc was still alive, living under an assumed name. So now finding Doc Rockefeller also became a brief national fixation, with publishing magnates Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst dispatching reporters as far away as Alaska to try and find the man.
And this is kind of interesting because guys like Pulitzer and Hearst were in many ways every bit as ruthless in their fields as Rockefeller was in his when it came to growing their brand and growing and getting the story and having the power and the influence. It was just a different field, and it wasn't one where they could make the same kind of money, but they did a lot of the same things. In fact, Pulitzer is kind of one of the antagonists of the musical Newsies. He's kind of one of the bad guys in that because he's the one that's putting everybody out of business and kind of running things differently and all that kind of stuff.
Man. However, by the time they did, he was already dead. His poor widow, not realizing her marriage had been bigamous, and her husband's son, the richest man in America, had buried him under the assumed name of Livingston. With that minor side quest completed, the concepts of trusts and their impact on American life began becoming topics discussed at porches and town halls across the country due to Tarbell's articles. After decades of unfocused discomfort over monopolies, there finally seemed specific charges to answer and the political will to do something about the trusts. A public mandate that was a godsend to America's new president, Theodore Roosevelt. A reformer and longtime critic of trusts, Roosevelt had unsuccessfully attempted to pass anti-monopoly legislation in the past as governor of New York.
And remember, as we said earlier, public perception and public opinion on this helps him a lot, because if nothing else, what it does is it probably gets him some people in his own party to maybe be willing to side with him. Because remember, if you're not familiar with government in the United States, Congress, our House of Representatives, which today has 435 members, they're elected every 2 years. And so they're intentionally with short terms, and so that, there's often opportunities for the people to speak. If they don't like the direction that their representative's going, they can vote them out. Senators serve for 6 years, and at this time, I believe this is before the amendment was passed where senators were directly elected by the people. So at this point, senators, the Senate, 2 senators from each state, are not even elected directly by the people. They're chosen by the state legislatures, but it's still a 6-year term. So there's not a direct influence by the people. But if public perception, public opinion is strongly against the trusts, you're much more likely to get the Republicans in Congress to be on your side to do something about it, which you're going to need to be able to do anything.
But keep in mind, this was an era of the political machine, where party bosses held sway over elected and appointed officials in a dirty system of patronage and reward, which of course current society in America could never relate to today. Conservative Republicans in New York, plus the Democrats of the Tammany Hall machine, had hamstrung Roosevelt's progressive agenda, stonewalling his attempts to clean up state politics and enact antitrust laws. Because Republicans were the party of big business, and both they and the old guard at Tammany regularly took bribes and campaign contributions from Standard, specifically so they would kill unfriendly legislation. Indeed, the reason Roosevelt had been nominated as vice president in the 1900 Republican convention was that New York Republicans
Get him out of New York.
that they could get Roosevelt and his progressive reform campaigns out of New York politics.
So they kicked him upstairs thinking he wouldn't do anything because he'd be vice president, which was like the weakest position you could possibly be in unless the president gets assassinated.
President McKinley was sure to win re-election, they reasoned, meaning Roosevelt would be neutralized in a subordinate role with little power. It worked. For a while. Because 5 months into McKinley's term, an anarchist shot and killed him. And Roosevelt could suddenly use the power of the executive branch to go after the trusts. So in February of 1902, 9 months before Tarbell's first Standard Oil article even appeared, Roosevelt took his first swing at the trusts.
And, notice they show him with boxing gloves. Roosevelt was a boxer, among many other things. In fact, he had a boxing ring set up, I think it was in the East Room of the White House, and at one point had a guy come in and he fought him, and the guy blinded Roosevelt in one eye from their boxing match. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that TR was doing.
His target was the Northern Securities Company, a holding company created by the 2 largest rail competitors in the Midwest and West Coast, with financing by banking titan J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller. Their goal was to control all of the rail lines between the Great Lakes and the ports of the Pacific Northwest. A monopoly that, as we saw with Standard, could grant a huge amount of power to set prices and control commerce. Roosevelt's weapon was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, a rarely used piece of federal legislation which had been passed after a number of massive corporate mergers in the 1880s. The Sherman Act gave the federal government power to break up any organization or contract found to be restraining trade, and had mostly been used against unions.
So in the 1880s, this is in the aftermath of what at the time was called the Great Depression. I think it was in the early 1870s. There was a massive depression, and a lot of people lost their jobs, and a lot of businesses went under, and you had some of these people, the Rockefellers of the world, come in and scoop up all these companies that were going out of business on the cheap. And this is where, so then in the 1880s, you start to see these massive companies being built, and so there was a response to that by the government to try and regulate those.
Roosevelt instructed the Justice Department to sue and break up Northern Securities as an illegal combination. And when the department followed through, Northern Securities then appealed the decision and entered a protracted court battle. Now, Roosevelt had gone out on a limb for that fight, particularly because a significant part of his own party were pro-business and financially dependent on the trust heads. In fact, a group of conservative Republicans even revolted against him, openly plotting to nominate one of their own in the 1904 election and make this cowboy a one-term president. It was a bruising political season for Roosevelt. Actually, quite literally in a way, because, fun fact, while all this was going on, he'd also taken up a form of stick fencing that regularly left him with black eyes, welts, and cuts on his hands, but that's beside the badass point.
And there are so many stories like that. My favorite story of his is about the time that he was out west, and somebody stole his boat. And my man got an axe, chopped down some trees, made another boat, chased these guys down the river without sleep for a couple of days, captured them, and without sleep, like I said, brought them back to face justice. That's the kind of guy we're talking about here. This dude does not mess around.
Because he was not done. He was just getting started. That year, he personally intervened in a coal miners' strike, mediating between the miners and J.P. Morgan to strike a bargain that raised wages and limited hours, but prevented the formation of a union. And then in 1903, with the swell of support from Ida Tarbell's articles, he moved on a much more ambitious set of bills. He wanted to create a Department of Commerce and Labor with an investigative agency called the Bureau of Corporations that would monitor and inspect companies for antitrust violations. In addition, he wanted to give more power to the already existing Interstate Commerce Commission and pass a law preventing railroads from giving rebates that diverted from published rates. All of this would give him the tools to go after the trusts on a broad scale. Congress was not cooperative. Republicans tried to prevent the proposal from coming to a vote, and many Democrats, hoping to paint Roosevelt as pro-trust, felt he didn't go far enough. But both parties said there simply wasn't enough time in the spring congressional session for this discussion. So
put it off until the elections, let the voice of the people be heard. Then they have a little more security, and then they can stand up for what they want to stand up for right after the elections. Yeah, this is where TR is going to bring in the idea of the bully pulpit, which now we take for granted as something that people do. People use the power of the office of president, the gravitas, the automatic kind of voice that gives you to steer public opinion. But that was something that was kind of new on the scene.
So Roosevelt used the bully pulpit. He threatened to call a special session, which would keep the congressmen from going home. And he engaged the press, letting it be known that Rockefeller had sent out telegrams to a number of Republican senators calling in favors from a lifetime of financial gifts. Oh yeah, the public uproar was enormous. Newspapers speculated which senators had been bought by Rockefeller and the trusts. Reporters bombarded senators' offices, and gradually, Roosevelt got his votes. In a last-ditch attempt to scuttle the laws, Standard Oil sent a team of lawyers to D.C. with instructions to draft an amendment that would blunt the bills and pass it to their Republican allies. But then Pulitzer's New York World found out about this, and the lawyers fled the Capitol with reporters on their heels. Roosevelt had his Bureau of Corporations, his legislation, and the next year, his first victory. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the government had been right to break up the Northern Securities Company.
It's amazing how many really significant kind of like history-altering decisions have been 5-4. I won't get into those now because I don't want to get into modern politics or anything like that, but especially recently there have been a lot of decisions that have been 5-4 that have dramatically altered the landscape of U.S. history.
Era of trust busting had begun, and John D. Rockefeller would become the richest fugitive in America.
So this is a fascinating story. I'm excited to continue the conversation. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Highly recommend you get into learning more about Theodore Roosevelt. I've never read a book on him. I've watched a lot of documentaries and read stories and tidbits here and there, but I'm really curious to get into a book about this topic. So if you have any good recommendations about a book about Theodore Roosevelt, if you like documentaries, if you like Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, he has one on the Roosevelts, on Teddy, Theodore Roosevelt, and also Franklin, who was his distant cousin and also his nephew-in-law. So check that out if you like documentaries and want to watch that. But let me know if you have any suggestions about a really good book about Theodore Roosevelt. I'd be curious to read that. Thanks. All right, so as promised, I almost forgot to do this when I was ending the video. This is from 1932. So this is the middle of the Great Depression. And this is John D. Rockefeller in his 90s talking about the return of prosperity for America. So my immediate reaction to that really isn't even about what he said, but it's just 93-year-old man, first of all, full life for sure. One of the richest men who ever lived, first billionaire in world history. But it's a good reminder, too, that no matter what you do in this life, it does come to an end. Our lives are finite. They have a beginning and an end. And even the richest, most successful, most powerful men in the world can't stop time. So that's just kind of my... but it's cool. It's cool to see someone from history like that and hear them speak and kind of see them as living, breathing people and not just people we read about on a page. So, all right. With that, we're going to wrap things up. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon. Welcome back, everybody, to part 3 of my reaction series to Teddy Roosevelt, Trustbuster. If you didn't see the first 2 episodes of the series, there's a link in the description that will take you back to episode 1. As always, I also include the link to the original content creator so you can check them out, support them. They have created great content for us to use to learn, to have a discussion, and to help grow this community. So we want to make sure that we say thank you to them for all the hard work that they've put in. So please check them out and give them a like and a subscribe if you haven't already. Let's dive right into part 3.
Election night, November 8th, 1904. President Theodore Roosevelt eats dinner with his family, awaiting results. It had been a rough campaign. Conservatives in his party had planned to oust Roosevelt, this unelected radical, at the convention. And
so Mark Hanna, Mark Hanna's kind of the, if you are old enough to remember somebody like, who's the guy I'm thinking of? George W. Bush had his real famous, well-known, had to pause until I thought of it, Karl Rove. So, a lot of campaigns have this very kind of visible, very outspoken, very powerful campaign managers. And Mark Hanna was William McKinley's kind of guy that ran the show for him. Hanna ends up a senator from Ohio himself. He was actually born in Lisbon, Ohio, which is like a half hour away from me. I go through there every week. So Mark Hanna, along with John D. Rockefeller, along with a lot of other really important famous people, are all buried in Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland. And I visited Mark Hanna's grave, among others. So if you want to see that, there's a link in the description that you can check out at the end of this video of my visit to Lakeview Cemetery. But yeah, Mark Hanna did not like Roosevelt. He was the total opposite of the kind of candidate that Hanna wanted to be in office, like a McKinley.
And only failed because their candidate died. Plus, with it considered unseemly to campaign while in office, because that used to be a thing, Roosevelt had to leave speeches and rallies to surrogates like William Howard Taft. Meanwhile, his Democratic opponent, Alton Parker, painted Roosevelt as erratic and owned by the trusts. Parker had even claimed that Roosevelt's campaign manager had used his former position as head of the new Bureau of Corporations to shake companies down for donations.
So isn't this interesting that the strategy, and sometimes this happens in politics, the very thing that you could least accuse him of being is what he gets accused of. There's a lot of things you might have been able to say about Theodore Roosevelt, but that he was in the pocket of big business and the trusts is not one of those things, and yet that's the accusation they use.
A lie that Parker embarrassingly retracted when Roosevelt challenged him to provide evidence. But now, the first telegrams begin to come in. It's a historic landslide, and by 9 p.m., Parker concedes. For the first time, the American people have chosen Roosevelt as their leader. And they've given him a mandate to go after the trusts. Thanks so much to Brilliant for helping us present today's historic tale. The election of 1904 was, up until that time, one of the most decisive in American history. Roosevelt won the Electoral College 336 to 140 and captured 18.8% more of the popular vote than Parker.
Now, that doesn't look like a huge amount, but that is an absolute landslide. Even 55-45 is about as big a margin as you can see these days. I mean, occasionally there's more. And you can see how just like it was 40 years earlier, the strong Democratic bastion is in the South, and they're basically holding the Confederacy as it existed. Other than Kentucky and Maryland, that's the Confederacy that voted for the Democrats.
The highest popular vote margin since 1820, when Martin Van Buren ran unopposed. The only thing that hurt him was the issue of campaign contributions. Parker had pointed out that Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and other magnates had made enormous donations to Roosevelt's political campaign, implying that he had been bought out by Standard. In fact, the attack was so worrying, Roosevelt's campaign manager had even tried to get the president to decline the corporate donations and rely instead on small individual contributions from supporters. But rather than seeing money in politics as a systematic problem that needed fixing, Roosevelt interpreted the attack a slight against his honor. He preferred to keep the contributions as a way to show that no matter if Rockefeller gave $100,000 to his campaign, he was still going to pursue Standard.
So you can donate to my campaign all you want. I'm going to take your money, I'm going to win re-election, and then I'm going to turn on you anyway. Good for him.
He felt that turning away the donations would be a signal that he'd done something wrong. And now that he'd won, he'd prove how wrong Parker had been. Armed with the Sherman Antitrust Act, his new Bureau of Corporations, a progressive press stoking outrage against monopolies, and a huge popular mandate, Roosevelt was finally in position to do battle against trust abuses, just in time for an opportunity to fall right into his lap. Oil drilling had been going on in Kansas since 1860, but output was low until an independent driller hit a gusher in 1892. It was the first strike in what's now known as the Mid-Continent Field, an oil deposit eventually determined to stretch from Kansas through Oklahoma to Texas and Louisiana. Independent producers rushed in to drill, followed by Standard Oil. At first, the independents were actually happy for Standard to be there. It put up oil pipelines and arranged railroad systems to transport the oil out, as well as establishing refineries.
But we know what's going to happen, right? Standard is going to eventually see these folks as competition that needs to be destroyed. And it's happened before, but remember, when all this news broke and all this news came to America through the press about what Standard Oil had done to people and putting other people out of business and kind of running a monopoly and a trust, it was after the fact, right? These are things that had already happened. Well, now they know that Standard Oil has done those things, and now they're going to see it happening again, and it's going to be a different story this time.
But then when it controlled all of the ways to get oil out, Standard raised the transportation costs and flooded the market with cheap oil, causing independent producers that had been making over $1 a barrel to now only making around 35 cents. No one could make a profit, and they were either going out of business or headed for buyouts. So they sounded the alarm, and Ida Tarbell showed up. To get there, she traveled by horse-drawn wagon through the worst sandstorm in decades. But when she arrived, she was greeted as something between a hero and a prophet. Hosted with parades, forced to give speeches from her hotel window, followed by reporters. It seemed she'd become the most famous woman in America. And though the crowds disturbed her writing, her celebrity meant more people approached her to tell their stories. And those stories were familiar. It seems Standard Oil was following the same playbook they'd used during the Pennsylvania oil wars of her youth.
So here's her opportunity. She can write in the press. Remember all that stuff you were outraged about a couple of years ago that Standard Oil was doing? They're doing it again. And that is going to be all Roosevelt needs to take them on.
Using secret railroad rebates and price fixing to drive competitors out, playing favorites on pipeline rates, bribing legislators to sink or blunt proposed antitrust laws, even tampering with juries. But as she wrote her article, she got a visit from James R. Garfield, the son of the former president and the current commissioner of the Bureau of Corporations. It seemed he was going down to Kansas himself to look into Standard's practices and was using Tarbell's notes as a guide. He verified every point she made, and then went back to Washington to help craft a two-pronged legal offensive against Standard.
You know, and the appearance of James R. Garfield is a great reminder that the idea of family political dynasties is not a new thing. You know, people think of the Clintons with Mr. and Mrs. Clinton, or the Kennedys, or the Bushes, these families that have multiple generations of people in government. That has been going on forever. The Garfields are a perfect example of that. And James Garfield, the President Garfield, his Secretary of War was Robert Todd Lincoln, the surviving son of Abraham Lincoln. John Adams, I think son or grandson, was Lincoln's minister to the UK at one point. William Howard Taft, his great-grandson, was the governor of Ohio a decade or so ago. So this has been going on as long as things have existed in politics. And sometime I might have to do a story, maybe a forgotten history story on Theodore Roosevelt's family, because his generations of his family continue to be very active in government. A lot of them ended up in things like the CIA, doing a lot of spy work and things like that. It's actually a really cool story to look into his grandkids, great-grandkids, and what they've done.
The first case would be based on the illegal rebates Standard had received, while the other would be a Sherman Antitrust Act suit, claiming the company was an illegal monopoly acting in restraint of trade. The illegal rebates case was the easiest to prosecute. It began in March 1907, when the government formally charged Standard Oil of Indiana with 1,903 violations of the Elkins Act,
Is that all?
the railroad rates law Roosevelt had pushed through in 1903. There's a fun numerical coincidence. The jury found Standard guilty on all of those counts, and the judge issued a subpoena to Rockefeller, compelling him to testify about Standard's operations in order to assess the size of the penalty. U.S. Marshals fanned out from Chicago, visiting every residence Rockefeller owned. But Rockefeller had defied subpoenas before. When state courts investigating Standard served him in the past, he exploited their limited power by simply never going in person to that state. Yet the U.S. Marshals were unrelenting, trying to slip past his armed Pinkerton guards and causing him to move from house to house in secrecy. It couldn't last. July 6th, 1907, Chicago. There's a crowd outside the courthouse, yelling at Rockefeller as his guards muscle their way through. The game is up, it seems. He's too old to keep running, so he's come here to testify. But with a strategy. On the stand, as the judge questions him, Rockefeller plays a semi-senile old man. He flubs basic facts, claims not to be able to remember events or details from just a few years earlier.
I don't recall. That is standard operating procedure when you don't want to admit to something, but you also don't want to perjure yourself. You just forget.
And repeats over and over that he'd stepped back from managing Standard over a decade ago. In one way, it works. John D. Rockefeller will not be going to prison. But in another way, it definitely doesn't. Because the judge decides to levy the maximum fine on every single rebated rail car. All 1,903 of them fining Standard Oil of Indiana. A whopping $29,240,000. It drew a gasp in the courtroom.
Let's put that in perspective for a second and see what that is in today's dollars. $29 million. Let's see, 1907 dollars to 20. Now, there's a lot of different ways to calculate inflation, so it's not just kind of a standard formula that you can use, but you can at least get some kind of an idea. That's $838 million today. I mean, that's basically, I don't know what the value of Standard Oil was at that time, but that's got to be a big chunk of the company.
The fine was by far the largest ever levied on an American corporation to that date. Granted, it would be appealed the next year, and a different judge eventually reversed it on a technicality. But just the fact that a judge had actually ruled against the trust, and ruled hard in more ways than one, encouraged prosecutors that they could now win in this arena. And the hits kept coming. In 1908, newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst read out a series of letters he'd obtained, where the vice president of Standard, John Archbold, sent multiple $15,000 checks to a senator and discussed antitrust legislation. Not a good look.
No, not.
Meanwhile, the Justice Department prepared its second case against Standard. It took years and 20,000 pages worth of supporting documents. But in 1909, the U.S. government sued Standard of New Jersey, the parent company of Rockefeller's empire. The Justice Department claimed that Standard was an illegal monopoly that used anti-competitive means, like rebates, price fixing, undercutting, secretly operating companies claiming to be independent, and espionage against competitors to restrain trade. The U.S. government won. And when Standard appealed to the Supreme Court, the U.S. government won
Ouch.
again in an 8-1 decision, with the one dissenter essentially saying the decision didn't go far enough. The judgment meant that Standard Oil would be broken up into 34 companies. Rockefeller got the news of the breakup by telegram while he was on the golf course with a priest.
Now, I don't know how much they'll go into this. I'm sure they will, but my understanding is that while on the surface this looked like a disastrous thing for Rockefeller, it actually is the thing that made Rockefeller the world's first billionaire. Now, a bunch of you have commented on that idea of first billionaire and said, hey, but wait a second. What about Marcus Crassus back in the Roman Empire? Or what about this person or that person? you know what? We're speaking specifically of the first person to have assets worth $1 billion. People in Rome 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago may have had the equivalent of that today, but they didn't have that much. Philip Van Rensselaer, who was married to Peggy Schuyler. If you're familiar with the Hamilton musical, Peggy was Hamilton's wife's sister. Her husband, I think it was, or maybe it was Stephen Van Rensselaer, would have probably been the richest man who ever lived if you take all of his land that he owned and equate it to today's dollars. That's not how they're calculating Rockefeller being the first billionaire. He's the first billionaire because he's the first guy that's worth $1 billion. Not in equivalent, but in real money. Equivalent today, he'd be worth like 400 billion. He'd be more than Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Warren Buffett put together. But yeah, I mean, breaking up the companies actually made him very, very wealthy.
It wasn't a surprise by then, and Standard had been preparing a game plan. Rockefeller turned to the priest and said, "If you have any money, buy stock in Standard Oil." Then he went on to shoot the best golf game of his life. And Rockefeller was right. As the breakup happened, forming 34 baby standards, the company's stock went through the roof. And Rockefeller personally owned 25% of Standard. It quadrupled his wealth, making Rockefeller the first ever billionaire and probably at the time, the richest man on earth. And the Standard of yesterday became the companies we all know today. Standard of New Jersey became Esso, and after another merger, Exxon. Standard of New York became Mobil, Standard of California became Chevron, and Standard of Indiana became Amoco. Now, it's debatable whether this actually fostered the competition.
And it goes deeper than that. I mean, the Standard of Ohio, so Ohio is a good chunk of what is BP today. A lot of other companies can trace their roots back to these standards that were broken up.
That the government and court contended. Because though separate, the companies still maintained an old boys network and generally tried to carve up the country and stay out of each other's way. And in recent years, some like ExxonMobil have even begun to recombine, though none have the power or reach Standard did in its heyday. But though it was arguably an incomplete victory, a victory it was, and not the last. Because when Roosevelt first saw that landmark $29 million fine overturned by the courts, he realized the judicial branch could not take on the trusts alone. After all, Rockefeller and his ilk could always hire the best lawyers. No, to strike the trusts where it hurts, he would need legislation. And he knew exactly who he needed to target. The ones at the center of the illegal rebates. The railroads. Choo-choo.
Choo-choo. All right, so let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Let's continue the conversation, talking about what was going on at this time. And we'll see you again tomorrow with part 4. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everybody, to part 4 of this reaction series to Extra History's Teddy Roosevelt Trustbuster. So I've gotten a couple of questions from folks about the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is something that's been referenced often in this series because it's been the basis of some of what the government is doing to take down the trusts that we're talking about here. And somebody asked me, they said, does that Sherman have anything to do with General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman from the Civil War? Well, it kind of does. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, William Tecumseh Sherman was actually raised in a political family early on. He grows up, he was born in Lancaster, Ohio, not to be confused with Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Those are the ways those are pronounced, depending on where you live. Lancaster, Ohio, right outside of Columbus. And at an early age, Sherman loses his parents, and he ends up going to live with the Ewing family. Well, Ewing was also, his foster father was also a senator, or was a senator, I should say. And so there's a lot of political kind of upbringing, not only in his biological family, but also his foster family. Long story short, General Sherman's brother, John Sherman, in 1860 is elected to the Senate out of Ohio, the U.S. Senate. And so from 1861 to 1897, John Sherman, General's brother, was a senator from Ohio, with the exception of 4 years in the middle of that when he serves as the Secretary of the Treasury for President Rutherford B. Hayes from 1877 to 1881. In 1897, he finally and permanently leaves the Senate after 32 years in the Senate, to serve as William McKinley's Secretary of State for a couple of years. And that was kind of where his career ended. But that's who the Sherman Antitrust Act is named after, is General Sherman's brother, John. All right, let's go ahead and dive into part 4. If you didn't see the first 3 parts, there's a link in the description below, as well as a link to the original content creator. Make sure to support them.
The House of Representatives, February 28, 1906. Theodore Roosevelt's new pet legislation, the Hepburn Bill, has just passed the House. The act prevents the kind of behavior Standard Oil and the railroads engaged in to create monopolies and control prices. Justice Department lawyers are still fighting for Standard's breakups in the courts, but Roosevelt has realized that's not a productive avenue.
So you notice he said the House of Representatives passed that. And we've already talked in previous episodes about the way things work in the United States. You have, at this point in history, senators who are elected by the state legislatures in their states. They're not directly elected by the people at this point. This will come a few years later with a constitutional amendment. The House of Representatives, they are elected by the people every 2 years. So the House tends to be much more in line with the politics of the moment, with the prevailing political viewpoints by people. So they're going to be a little ahead of where the Senate is. And so with all the public outcry over Standard Oil and its practices and trusts in general, you're going to see a lot more movement on that in the House of Representatives and a lot less movement in the Senate.
They'll never catch everyone. To break the power of the trusts, Roosevelt can't rely on prosecuting illegal behavior after it's occurred. He has to prevent it with legislation. But the progressive-leaning House of Representatives isn't the real fight. That'll happen in the more conservative Senate, where Roosevelt will have to broker deals and make alliances to get the bill through, including with the congressman he hates most. Thanks so much to Audible for helping make our extra history
Audible's
research
awesome.
fun.
I can't wait until the day that I get sponsored by them, because I love Audible, and I would love nothing more than for them to give me just, I'll give you free ads on my channel. Just give me a lifetime membership to get as many Audible books as I can.
In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt gave a public speech discussing the role of journalism in the progressive movement. Illustrating the good and ill of crusading journalism, he compared them to a character from the philosophical novel Pilgrim's Progress, who used a rake to clear away muck.
The men with the muck rakes are often indispensable to the well-being of society,
Roosevelt said.
but only if they know when to stop raking the muck.
This speech showed Roosevelt's sometimes rocky relationship with the progressive press, who always pushed him to go further, but who he was also happy to cultivate and promote if it served his purposes. Indeed, political cartoons of the day cast Roosevelt as a crusading king, surrounded by knights representing prominent journalists and publications, with Ida Tarbell as Joan of Arc.
So, a lot of people have this idea of Theodore Roosevelt as the all-time great American. Like, he's the tough guy, the guy who killed bears with his bare hands and hunted down people who stole his boat and those kinds of things. And he was all of those things. He absolutely was. But he also was a very shrewd politician who knew how to play the game of politics. He knew how to cultivate public opinion. He knew how to schmooze the right people to get what he needed to get done. He knew how to kind of, manipulate and, shape things to his will.
The speech also gave Americans a new term for these investigative, story-breaking journalists: muckrakers. A label, for what it's worth, that Ida Tarbell hated. However, she was not the only investigative journalist taking on corruption and big business. In the same issue where she began her series on Standard Oil, her McClure's colleague Ray Baker took on the use of intimidation and violence by labor unions against their own members. But it was Baker's investigation into a minor workers' strike in Colorado that first brought him Theodore Roosevelt's attention. There, corporations, crooked politicians, and banks had ostensibly squeezed the miners' union on the issue of working hours until they'd ignited a full-on revolt, with miners bombing company mine shafts and beating or assassinating new workers brought in to replace the strikers.
Can we just not kind of gloss over the fact that they just said beating or assassinating what we call scabs, the people who came in to break the strike and work in their behalf? This is ugly stuff. I mean, this was violent stuff. You think that politics is ugly today, and you think that that what you see on the news every day is something new. It is not.
The governor, a banker himself, declared martial law and brought in the army. They arrested miners without warrants and threw them on deportation trains. One soldier threatened a judge with a bayonet outside of his own court. Baker, eminently fair, charted how foul play on all sides had escalated the conflict,
Yep,
and
both
shared
sides.
his article with Roosevelt before publication. Roosevelt liked the piece so much, he wrote a statement endorsing the article. And that collaboration would not be their last, as the young president and crusading investigator found their interests aligning again the next year on the issue of railroads. Baker's next article examined how the railroad trusts, many partially owned by titans like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan, used lawyers and corporate structures to skirt the new laws against rebates and still offer discounted rates to favored big businesses. Baker pointed out that this was particularly unfair, considering that the government had literally given the land to railroads in order for them to lay track.
That's true. I mean, if you look back in the 19th century when the railroads were expanding and connecting the country from the Atlantic to the Pacific and culminating with that big moment when Ulysses S. Grant is present, not the version that you see in the movie Wild Wild West, but similar, where he's present when they go to Promontory Point, Utah, and they connect the first transcontinental railroad. A lot of this was subsidized by the government. There was a ton of corruption that went on with those government subsidies. And so this is nothing new, but these very companies that were propped up and built up and enabled by the government are now the ones that are flaunting the rules right in the government's face and going around them.
If it was a public service, it should serve the public good. Once again, Roosevelt got early access to Baker's research, passing it on to the Interstate Commerce Commission and progressive lawmakers to begin crafting what would become the Hepburn Bill. Now, without getting too technical, the Hepburn Rate Act, named after the man who introduced it, would empower the ICC to regulate railroad shipping rates in the interest of leveling the playing field for businesses small and large. Going beyond rebates, the Hepburn Bill allowed the ICC to look at railroad companies' books and made it illegal to give out free passes to other companies' goods. And crucially for Rockefeller's business, it also covered pipelines.
So, we talk a lot about capitalism in America and how America was built on capitalism, but this is very much an anti-capitalist viewpoint here. I mean, this is the government getting directly involved in how companies can run their business and how they can set their prices. And this all still, a lot of this stuff exists today. So it is not unfettered capitalism in the United States. And a lot of that goes back to these things that were happening. Now, I'm not making a judgment on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think we could probably all at least agree that the government should have some degree of involvement in this stuff, but to what degree is really the question and the debate that has gone on since the beginning of time.
It passed the House of Representatives, where progressive Republicans were a major force, without amendment, and barreled on to the Senate, where it hit a brick wall, because there was one group that did not want this to pass. The conservative wing of Roosevelt's own Republican Party, many of whom had taken campaign contributions and personal free passes from the railroads. Chief among them was Republican leader Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was well known for killing progressive legislation that would impact big business.
And, I don't want to get too much into this, and I intentionally stay away from modern politics on this channel, but this is just one of many reasons why when people talk about things like party switches, you can't just say that happened, because there's so many layers to this. Okay, political parties, we have a two-party system in America, which right now is Republican and Democrat. Occasionally you have more, and I think we would all benefit from a multi-party system, but that's just not the way things are right now in this country. But it is not as simple as saying, oh man, the Republicans of today were the Democrats of yesterday, because even back then you had progressive Republicans like Roosevelt, you had conservative Republicans who were pro-business. They were still conservative, but they're pro-business and things like that. And then you still have Democrats who are primarily at this point in the South. So there's multiple layers to all of this, and there was no strict party switch. There are elements of things that have evolved and changed over time, certainly. And one could argue that in some ways the conservative party of that time was the Democrats, but there was also a strong conservative Republican component. It's very, very multi-layered and deep and complex, and we've had multiple what we call party systems over time. We're like in the fifth or sixth party system at this point. The parties will change. 20 years from now, the parties will look very different than they do today. 100 years from now, they may look completely different than they do today. They may not even be parties as we know them today. Who knows?
Having previously monkeyed with tariff rates to please the Sugar Trust, he also personally owned part of Rhode Island's trolley system until earlier that year he sold it to a railroad trust for an enormous profit. Aldrich and his conservatives attacked Roosevelt as a secret socialist, tying him to the furthest left elements of the party who wanted to nationalize the railroads.
Sound familiar?
In addition to refusing to pass the bill, Aldrich decided to hobble it further by delegating leadership on it to a prominent Democrat, and the senator Roosevelt hated most, Pitchfork Ben Tillman. Now, it's really hard to understate what an odious figure Benjamin Tillman was. Called Pitchfork Ben for his fiery speeches, Tillman rose to prominence during the fall of Reconstruction, when he led a paramilitary terrorist militia called the Red Shirts in a campaign of ballot box stuffing, voter intimidation, and murder against South Carolina's black community.
And I'm working on the very early stages of my script for a Forgotten History episode, or maybe even a series on Reconstruction. Reconstruction's a topic that doesn't get talked about enough, but is one of the ugliest and darkest chapters in American history. Honestly, between what was done to freed men and women, former slaves in the South in the latter half of the 19th century, combine that to what was going on with Native Americans at that time, and honestly, you could argue that the darkest days of American history, the worst stains on our country as a people happened in that 40 or 50 year stretch after the Civil War, or including the Civil War, if you will. And this guy was a big part of that.
A vocal proponent of the idea that African Americans must either be subservient or exterminated, he was for decades the most open white supremacist in Congress. And just for the record, in 1906, that's really saying something. He and Roosevelt loathed each other. In 1901, Roosevelt invited African-American educator Booker T. Washington to formally and publicly dine with the Roosevelt family at the White House.
First time.
The first time a black man had done so.
People will automatically argue, wait a second, Abraham Lincoln had Frederick Douglass to the White House. Yeah, but it was always kind of a low-key thing this was not the first time a black person went to the White House as a guest. It's the first time a president made a big deal about it publicly and really kind of embraced this and wanted people to know it was happening and went out of his way to show it. This was a big, big deal.
Tillman's response to this act was so racist that I'm not even going to repeat it here. But I'll put it up here on the screen so you get an idea what kind of man this guy was.
Horrible human being. Just disgusting. Yeah.
Their
That's
relationship
fair.
deteriorated further the next year when Roosevelt withdrew Tillman's invitation to a White House dinner after he'd punched a fellow senator on the floor of Congress. And look, we could go on all day about how awful Tillman is, but ultimately this is an episode about railroad trusts, and I'm pretty sure by now you get how bad this guy sucked. But as much as Roosevelt hated Tillman, he was also a major opponent of the trusts. In fact, he was part of the Democratic bloc, attacking Roosevelt for not going after the trusts even harder. Despite their mutual distaste, Roosevelt reached out to Tillman, opening a channel of communication to negotiate on the finer points of the bill.
And this is another example of why you just can't say that there's been a party switch, because this is actually still a position and a philosophy that I think is largely embraced by the Democratic Party, which is the idea of regulating business and things of that nature. And whereas the Republicans are going to tend to be more about deregulation and opposing those kinds of things. And so that's actually still largely true. So there's elements of all of that. That's why I abhor when people say there was a party switch. You can't just say that. It's way more complicated than that.
Things didn't change between them. In fact, they never met in person, instead talking through a go-between. But they did work together as Tillman steered the bill through committee. Meanwhile, Roosevelt continued meeting with Ray Baker, getting his opinion on the legislation. Baker, to put it mildly, wasn't happy, because the Hepburn Bill was mostly concerned with regulating maximum shipping rates, ensuring railroads couldn't jack up prices on the smaller companies. But Baker argued the real problem was the minimum rates, because while raising rates got everyone's attention, it was the fact that the railroads played favorites by lowering rates for big companies that created unfair competition. He also showed Roosevelt how the railroads nickel and dimed smaller shippers by charging them more for elevator services, storage, refrigeration, and chronically underweighing shipments from favored companies. In fact, at this point, Baker pushed Roosevelt so hard to go even further than he was that the president became annoyed with him. Sure, he knew his ideas were good, but he also knew they wouldn't pass Congress, especially in his Tillman alliance.
And this is again showing the brilliance of Roosevelt, that he's not going to let the emotion of all of this get the best of him. He's going to be practical and say, listen, I want to go after these guys. I want to do the right thing, but I also recognize there are limits to how far we can push this. And he kind of has to deal with it from both ends. He's got the conservatives in the Republican Party who are pushing back against anything being done. He's got the liberals in the Republican Party, the more progressive, who want to push things. He's got the Democrats saying you aren't going nearly far enough, and he's got to try and balance all of this and try to find something that he can get done.
But Roosevelt's attempt to reach across the aisle failed. Tillman couldn't rally enough Democratic support to pass the bill, even combined with the Senate's progressive Republicans. Their partnership fractured, their relationship even worse, and Roosevelt back at square one. If he wanted to do anything, Roosevelt realized he needed a middle way. Because on one hand, he had Democrats and progressive Republicans who wanted to nationalize railroads, a solution conservatives would not accept, and on the other, he had conservatives that wanted to do nothing. So he started fresh, reverting back to the original bill before it had been augmented with amendments suggested by Baker, Tillman, and pretty much everyone else. It was a simpler bill, one that did what Roosevelt wanted, but was much more moderate. It passed. Sure, it was full of loopholes and extraneous amendments, and would need to be strengthened in 1910, but Roosevelt...
And those amendments were probably things that were little favors to people. When you're trying to get enough votes together to make something pass, and you might find yourself a couple votes short, sometimes you got to throw a bone here and there to people to get things done. It sucks, but that's politics.
Had done what was previously thought impossible, to restrain a trust not just with the courts, but with preemptive legislation. Even Tillman set aside his qualms and voted for it. And that was good, because even as Roosevelt celebrated his latest victory against the trusts, a new book had come out detailing shocking abuse, danger, and monopoly in another American industry, the slaughterhouses of Chicago.
Oh yeah, that's something I learned a lot about in school.
Roosevelt's next task was to take a cleaver to the meat trust.
The meat trust. All right, so we'll get into that one tomorrow. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of comments because I dove into a little bit of politics today. But please keep it civil. Please keep it friendly. I have no problem bringing out the delete button if I have to, if you can't do that. So thank you in advance, and we'll see you again tomorrow with the next episode. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everybody, to the fifth and final episode of Teddy Roosevelt Trustbuster, my reaction series to the Extra Credits, Extra History series of the same name. Hope you guys have enjoyed this. It seems like you have. It's nice to get a look at some things that aren't necessarily focused on war. I know that war is kind of the sexy history. It's the thing most people are interested in, myself included. But I'm always looking for ways to kind of stretch and learn new things and get outside of that box. If you are subscribed and you have notifications on, you may have seen my post last night. If not, do so now and check it out. I am looking for ideas along with the other original content that I do, whether it's the Forgotten History series, which seems to be picking up in terms of getting noticed, which is awesome. Thank you to all of you, and welcome if you're new because of that. In addition to my historic site videos, which I've been doing, and I have more coming up soon, I also want to start experiencing some living history. And so I did a post yesterday asking for your help with ideas about places I could go to experience that. where's somewhere I can go and fire a Civil War rifled musket for myself? Where's somewhere I can go and jump in a tank? And, some of you have already given me some answers. There's a place down in Texas, I guess you can go for a lot of money and fire a Sherman tank and drive it around, stuff like that. So those are the kinds of things I'm looking for. Somewhere I can go and learn how to make soap like they did it in the 1500s, that kind of thing. So I'm looking for ideas of where I can go and experience living history, record that, and bring that to you on the channel. So if you have those ideas, find my post and reply to it, or reply right on here. That'd be great too. Let's go ahead and dive into this fifth and final part of Teddy Roosevelt Trustbuster.
Chicago, Illinois, 1904. Upton Sinclair has realized that, provided he carries a lunch pail, he can go basically anywhere, blending in with workers while walking the floors of Chicago's infamous slaughterhouses and packing plants, watching men work industrial meat cutters and grinders. His goal is to expose the grotesque labor abuses of the meat industry in a serialized novel he's writing for the socialist newspaper Appeal to Reason. He sees workers lose fingers to saws and subsequently lose their jobs and financial security, witnesses the mistreatment of the largely Lithuanian immigrants working the factories, hears stories of men falling into meat grinders, minced with the meat, and sees foul droppings and diseased meat swept off the floor and put into sausages.
See, we take this kind of stuff for granted, that kind of thing doesn't really happen anymore. Now we know it probably does here and there, but by and large, we live in a society today where all of that stuff is closely watched and there are standards. But, even 100 years ago, that wasn't the case. There really weren't standards for things. And this is, again, I don't want to get too far into the political realm of things, but this is where, regardless of where you stand politically, right, left, center, or anywhere in between, there are certain ways in which having government is helpful, because certain regulations, I think, are no-brainers, right? I mean, regulations about things like this should be no-brainers, but they weren't 100 years ago. These were things that were fought against. These were things that had to be won and had to be, these bills had to be passed, things that we have grown up always just accepting that certain things are okay. They weren't always.
The resulting novel, The Jungle, will spur Roosevelt's next big battle against the trusts. Thanks so much to CuriosityStream for helping to keep the history flowing. Despite being labeled a socialist by his conservative Republican rivals, Theodore Roosevelt in actuality had little regard for socialism. In fact, he was largely pro-business. Much like Ida Tarbell, he didn't particularly care how large the trusts got, provided they did it honestly.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction to make, and I think some of you maybe misunderstood me yesterday as implying that the government passing regulations was anti-capitalist. If I gave that impression, that was not my intention. I think there absolutely is a place for the government, like I said. And Roosevelt, this is a good distinction here. And this is where men of integrity come along. He sees both sides of this. He says, you know what? We're a free country. We're a capitalist country. There should be freedom for people in business to do really well and succeed and become very wealthy, provided they do it within the rules. And here are the rules. You step outside those boundaries, we're going to come after you. And that's an important distinction. And if you have to pass new rules to kind of, rein them in a little bit, then you'll do that.
Actually, it could be argued that his reputation as a radical trustbuster is undeserved, since he didn't really bust most of the trusts he went after. He was really more of a trust regulator. In fact, Roosevelt didn't believe trusts were inherently bad, and he often admired the charity work undertaken by captains of industry like Rockefeller and Carnegie. And anytime someone proposed actual socialist policies, like nationalizing the railroads, Roosevelt generally ran the other direction, because he disliked socialism and socialists, and as a result, was skeptical of Upton Sinclair's claims when he first read The Jungle, particularly since Sinclair's novel ended with a heavy-handed scene of the protagonist attending a socialist meeting as a way to lecture and convert the reader.
And see, this is where it gets difficult, is that, and this is really true in today in our society as well. If we don't like the messenger, we often ignore the message. And sometimes we can disagree vehemently with the motivation behind something, disagree vehemently with the politics of a person, but we can agree with what they have to say. And I think that's something we've largely lost in this country. You know, if it's not the guy you voted for, anything he does or says is going to be bad. Anything that the person you voted for does or says is going to be good no matter what. And we've lost the ability for nuance and to understand that, you know what, some people, you might disagree with them, but like them. I'll give you a perfect example of this. And again, not trying to get into politics, not trying to defend people, but, George W. Bush, for example, here's a person that was very polarizing politically. And to this day, even many years after his presidency, that's the case. But by and large, you talk to the people who were his opponents on the Democratic side, they all liked him personally. They just didn't like his policies. And they were able to distinguish between the two. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill was the Democrat Speaker of the House, had a very good relationship personally, even though they fought like cats and dogs politically and in public. They respected each other personally. I think we have a hard time doing that anymore. And it seems like Roosevelt was having a hard time with Upton St. Clair's work, even though there was truth to what St. Clair was saying, but because of how it was packaged coming from a socialist, he had a hard time accepting it.
Despite that, he invited Sinclair to the White House to talk about the book and the conditions in the meat plants. Of course, he thought Sinclair was exaggerating and even referred to him as a crackpot. But if just a third of what Sinclair claimed was true, then that meant there was something very wrong in the nation's meat industry.
And this, again, says a lot about Theodore Roosevelt as a person. He may have thought, you know what, this guy's nuts, and probably everything he's saying is exaggerating, but he was responsible enough and a man of integrity enough to say, I should at least talk to him. Let's meet face to face. He didn't go out publicly and just trash the guy and say he's nuts, he's stupid, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He met him face to face, man to man, and talked about it, and asked him questions and decided to learn. That's what people should be doing.
The picture of poverty, exploitation, and the revoltingly unhygienic practices he'd painted in the jungle was so viscerally upsetting to the public that both domestic and international orders for American meat dropped by half. So despite his skepticism, Roosevelt dispatched a group of his most trusted government officials to inquire about plant conditions. Surprise inspections, which the Meat Trust unfortunately got wind of and went on a 3-week sanitation campaign. But even that wasn't enough. When Roosevelt received the subsequent report, he was shocked to discover that Sinclair had not lied about factory conditions. They discovered unbelievable filth, from walls painted with old blood, to tuberculosis-infected beef being packaged for sale, to rotting pork being bathed in preservatives like formaldehyde and borax, to meat that was entirely mislabeled, passing off goat or horse as beef. Popular fury was so intense that this was one blow against the trusts Roosevelt wouldn't even have to fight for.
So imagine going to your local supermarket and getting what you think is ground beef, and really it's goat meat, or it's got tuberculosis in it. Or, it was done in these horrible conditions, just filled with bacteria. We assume that our meat is good, and you see the stamp on there, USDA and things like that. Boy, those are the kinds of things that we have Theodore Roosevelt to thank for.
He drew up 2 bills for the 1906 Congress. The first was the Pure Food and Drug Act, a wide-ranging statute that banned the foreign and interstate traffic of mislabeled, impure, or contaminated food and medicine. It allowed for the U.S. Bureau of Chemistry, later renamed the Food and Drug Administration, to carry out inspections and refer violations to prosecutors. It also required the food and drug manufacturers to label major ingredients, a provision striking out at both mislabeled meat and the U.S. patent medicine industry, which regularly sold products with secret ingredients.
So this is a big blow to the snake oil salesman, right? You can't just sell things without disclosing what's inside of it.
That included cocaine and opium. In fact, many of these medicines were also loaded with sugars and flavoring, which led to a rash of children overdosing when they drank the bottles like candy. It also labeled 10 substances common in medicine, including alcohol, opium, cocaine, cannabis, and morphine, as addictive and dangerous, requiring that their presence be disclosed on the packaging. Products found in violation could be seized and destroyed at the company's expense, in addition to a fine. Next came the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which mandated Department of Agriculture inspections of every animal before and after slaughter, spelled out standards for sanitation at meat plants, and authorized the government to monitor operations. Despite these two victories, Sinclair himself was disappointed that people had fixated on food purity rather than the condition of workers.
Remember, he's a socialist, and so he really was motivated not necessarily by let's clean this up, but let's make things better for the workers. And Theodore Roosevelt, he wants to do the right thing, but he's also still a pretty pro-business guy. So he's gonna shy away from the whole help the workers, it might be viewed as socialism, that sort of thing.
I aimed for the heart, he reflected, and hit them in the stomach. But even so, it was the end of an extraordinary legislative season. In fact, the 59th U.S. Congress was one of the most productive in history. In addition to the Pure Food and Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act, and Hepburn Railroad Rates Act, the 59th Congress also passed a key law regulating citizenship, an Antiquities Act allowing the president to declare national monuments, and chartered the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, which played a major role in developing American education. But despite all this success, it should be noted that the Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act were compromises, watered down from what Roosevelt had truly hoped for. And compromise was something Roosevelt increasingly became familiar with during his last years in office.
But compromise is the story of politics, right? I mean, if you get everything you want, then you haven't had to compromise. If nobody's happy, then there's a good chance that you've come up with a good compromise. And again, that's something we've lost. We are in a world today where it's all or nothing. I either get it my way or I'm taking my ball and going home. We've lost the art of the compromise, unfortunately.
Because in the exuberance of his election night win in 1904, he'd made a promise that he now regretted. Having served nearly 2 terms due to McKinley's assassination, he had promised not to run again.
And today, he wouldn't have been able to run again, but those laws weren't in place at the time. We've since passed a constitutional amendment that if a vice president serves more than half of a term that he inherits because of the death or resignation of a president, that counts as his term. So the most a person can serve legally today would be 10 years as president. They could become president, serve the last 2 years, and then serve 2 full terms. But he was under no such obligation at the time. But he picks William Howard Taft, who I think was his Secretary of War, to replace him.
And while that freed his hand to be more active and take politically risky positions in his second term, it also meant that both the trusts and conservative Republicans knew that they just had to wait him out. In 1908, he proposed a bill to strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act, but saw it shot down in Congress. He then tried to set up a National Bureau of Insurance in order to tame anti-consumer practices in the insurance markets, but that was dead on arrival as well. However, even without Congress, Roosevelt could effect change, sometimes merely by the threat of an antitrust suit. Andrew Carnegie's U.S. Steel, the most prominent steel trust, actually voluntarily agreed to an investigation by the Bureau of Corporations, and other large trusts agreed to cooperate as well. But there was one time he couldn't help but let the trusts win. November 4th, 1907, the White House. The country is in a panic. Stock market dives and the sudden crash of several trust banks, wiping out depositors' savings, have plunged consumer confidence. People are terrified, moving their money out of the market, and worse, withdrawing it from banks. If this continues, the entire system might collapse. But J.P. Morgan, a man Roosevelt has tangled with when he filed an antitrust suit over the Northern Securities Company, has a plan. You see,
J.P. Morgan has a plan. He always has a plan, kind of like Bismarck. So again, I've mentioned this in previous episodes, but if you want to really get into the story of men like Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and others, The Men Who Built America by the History Channel is fantastic in telling you these men's stories and also showing how they're all connected to each other, because they all are connected to each other. They all either got rich because of one another or kind of competed against one another, but they all really kind of, were a part of the same story. And yeah, I know the History Channel doesn't do a lot of history content these days, but when they do, it's usually pretty good, even if it's not always 100% accurate in what they're showing, at least on screen.
See, part of this new panic of 1907 had come from a large brokerage house, borrowing massive sums with the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company as collateral. But now that TCNI stock price was collapsing, if U.S. Steel purchased TCNI, it would calm the markets. However, U.S. Steel already owns 60% of the steel market and doesn't want to face an antitrust suit as a monopoly. So they ask for Roosevelt to sign off on it personally. They will save the economy, but in return, he can't go after them for the purchase. It's Monday morning. The stock market will open in an hour. Roosevelt has to decide fast. He has no choice. He agrees to let the deal go through. Ultimately, Roosevelt would use the Sherman Antitrust Act 40 more times during his presidency, more than his 3 predecessors combined.
So you see, again, this is an art of compromise. He has to do something to bail out the economy, and that means compromising on something he might otherwise have normally gone after. But, give credit to J.P. Morgan. He was willing to step up. Yeah, granted, it was something that was going to help him too, but it was also something that helped the country. And so it kind of worked out well for everybody.
And his ally and chosen successor, William Howard Taft, would use it 75 times. But while Roosevelt's battle against the trusts has become legendary, the results themselves were more mixed. As we mentioned previously, the breakup of Standard Oil, his biggest victory, may not have actually led to much more competition. In the 1920s, when Ida Tarbell wrote a retrospective article on Standard's breakup, she pointed out that over a decade later, the competition that the government had hoped to create hadn't yet materialized. Maybe, she suggested, it would take another decade for the results to truly begin to show. Indeed, in our modern day, we can actually see parts of Standard recombining via merger, with Exxon and Mobil joining forces. But it's important to note that even these megacorporations only have a fraction of the power Standard once had.
All the companies that were a part of Standard Oil that have since re-merged, and here's a perfect example of it. So right here, you can see the Standard Oil of Kentucky and Standard Oil of California became Chevron, became Unocal. They took on Texaco, and that's Chevron today. Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon Mobil. They were Mobil and Exxon, and then those two combined. Standard Oil of Ohio, which of Indiana, became Amoco, and then Sohio, which are now a part of BP, and the Ohio Oil Company, which was renamed Marathon and is now Marathon Petroleum. So those are just a few examples, and there are actually far more than that. You can see how Shell came out of Standard Oil, ConocoPhillips. I believe that Sunoco is also in there somewhere. Here's another really good one that shows a whole lot more of it. Here's Sunoco and Shell and Hess and Pennzoil and Gulf and 76. Pilot comes out. I mean, look at all of that. And now they're merging and slowly becoming one company again. So kind of interesting to see how history comes full circle.
Particularly because they fear antitrust suits. Breakups are rare, but in 1982, AT&T was forced to divest itself of the Bell telephone system. A 1999 case came close to breaking up Microsoft, and as we wrote this series, the Justice Department filed an antitrust suit against Google, and the Federal Trade Commission, the successor to Roosevelt's Bureau of Corporations, filed another against Facebook. Which just goes to show that even a century later, the big questions of Roosevelt's era still live on. Should the government provide a check on unrestrained capitalism? How can Congress regulate when its members are financially tied to companies? And what role does the press play in all of this? Because while Theodore Roosevelt gave us the tools to act if warranted, the question of when to use them is still up to us.
So all excellent questions, and I think it's going to boil down to, obviously some of the big questions we're asking about that right now remain things like Facebook and Twitter and things like that. And it's really going to come down to whose side are they on and who's in power and who benefits from going after them versus using them as a tool to help their side and all those sorts of things. But fantastic series. I think it's something that we all need to learn a little more about. Coming in a few days is going to be a long series on the history of Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. So be watching for that, and also some more original content coming your way. I hope you enjoyed this. Please consider becoming a patron. to support what we do, it would be greatly appreciated. And there's some great merch and things like that that you can receive in return. So thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.